probably digress a little from the heading of the topic, but we'll see where it goes. And I think I'm probably going to walk more in the grey areas than giving you a lot of answers this morning. But good morning. Thank you for the invitation to speak to you in what I think promises to be a couple of very interesting days. I'm going to speak for, hopefully for no more than about 30 minutes or so and leave a few minutes for questions. But I'll start off, why is the discussion of ethics important? Why does it matter at any level, including theatre and strategic? I think it's because the decisions that are made or influenced, it's because decisions are made and influenced by individuals. And those decisions are influenced by people's personal views, their values, their attitudes, their experience, prejudices, individual views of morality, and this occurs whether you consciously acknowledge it or not. And it does have direct operational consequences, from the planning phase to the conduct of operations to the situation you find yourself in when combat operations cease. I ask the question, can you actually have ethics in war, or is it inherently contradictory? Is it a contradiction that contemporary, I think primarily Western societies, see some need for an ethical or moral justification for a political decision that may lead to killing? Arguably, it's easier for us to justify operations if we call them peacekeeping or humanitarian operations rather than conventional war. In fact, you've only got to look at some of our advertising and recruiting to see where the emphasis lies. However, politics and legal constraints aside, I would suggest that it is ethics that distinguishes us from barbarism and perhaps allows you to live with your decisions and actions afterwards. So I think there are some contradictions. I think there is a little bit of hypocrisy in how we go about it, but I still think ethics is absolutely important. So what experience brings me to that point? What informed my views? I suppose a lot of my remarks come from on the strategic, the national or theatre level, are informed by my time as a Colonel Operations and Joint Operations and Plans for the first Timor operation. My time at Strategic Command as Director General Joint Ops and Plans for the ADF, with operations quite different, such as Anaconda in Afghanistan at that time, CHOGM, and cleaning up the mess after the children overboard issue. Then as National Commander in the Middle East in 2002, 2003, where we were actually gone for about 5 or 6 months doing things before the government actually announced we were going to go. Well, the team that was with me was. And finally, as Director of the Defence Intelligence Organisation, which also got me involved in Iraq, Afghanistan, the second Timor operation, and some of the sort of moral issues that Professor Dunlap has just raised. What shaped my views on ethics? How do we actually train on these things? Because I can tell you, it's too late to start discussing ethics or thinking about what your ethical position is going to be when you get to the situation. And I'd argue that ethics and ethics training is highly perishable and can be distorted along the way, and I'll come back to distortion. So I'd say that a lot of what influenced me when I had to make decisions was shaped by day-to-day issues in the years prior, by training, education, mentoring, experience and culture of the organisation. I ended up very strongly with the view that the unethical officer in peace or in barracks is unlikely to change on operations. So these discussions, these conferences and how we train is very important. So where did I learn as I progressed? Well, I think probably the most valuable lessons I got was from people I served under. As Colonel Operations under Mike Keating during Timor, and with Peter Cosgrove being in Timor at the time, who we dealt with a lot. People such as Al Tithridge, who as Senior Air Force Officer was Head of Strategic Command. And again with Peter Cosgrove and Ken Gillespie on different operations right through that period, and having the two of them sitting above me when I was in Iraq. I also learnt the value of having people you can debate issues with and war game them as you're going into an operation. I learnt that ethics and values lists are only words. It's how you interpret them and how you give them form that matters. And sometimes there is no easy or good decision. Sometimes it's just going to be a bad or an even worse ethical decision. Sometimes as a commander, it's about the art of the possible. Values will not provide you the answers, only a guidepost perhaps, and at the end of the day, you'll make subjective decisions and you'll make compromises. So discussion, training, example and mentors are important, but you also comes the understanding that you make the call and you're accountable at the end of the day. My experience, and you can only go on your own, reinforced to me that ethics is highly personal, that what one person may think is reasonable and central to their values and decision-making may be anathema to another. I've worked with people who claimed that we were doing God's work in the Middle East. I found it quite disturbing, but it was clearly quite perfectly reasonable to that person and others. And this isn't theoretical, and it can impact decision-making. I also noted that some people found it very easy to be ethical and at times righteously indignant about ethics, and very black and white, if it didn't directly impact them. And it's always very different making ethical decisions when you've got the skin in the game, where you're accountable or responsible for the operation. So the ethics of an operational war, the strategic decisions, the theatre decisions, do you have a role? I note that the traditional just war theory can provide a framework, sets of principles satisfying what is necessary and sufficient for a war being permissible, if there's such a thing. To set the scene for me as a commander, 6 typical principles were a useful backdrop, things such as just cause, legitimate authority, right intention, reasonable prospects of success, proportionality, last resort. These points will always be an issue for debate, and they were before, during and after Iraq. There can be quite polarised ethical positions and polarised political debate around those points. And you might perhaps contrast Timor with Iraq in that light, or different characterisations of Iraq and Afghanistan in terms of morality or the justness of the commitments, where people would sometimes describe one as a good war and the other one as a bad war. Most wars seem to be pretty bad as far as I've seen. Yet even at the theatre level, I saw limited scope for discussions about just war or the rights and wrongs of a particular conflict. That may not sit comfortably with some people. You might have influence in the information you provide to decision makers, but it won't be your decision. And for a number of reasons, it may be ignored. The facts may be ignored. I have noted those 6 principles that I mentioned simply because they may provide a framework within which you operate, so you need to be aware of them. They will influence at the strategic level, and it flows all the way down to tactical level, your freedom in decisions or not. The level of political or senior officer interference, the 10,000 kilometre screwdriver. Resourcing, which puts limitations on what you can do or can put your people at risk, and the rules of engagement, the role of the media and community reaction, and explaining the purpose to your troops, to name but a few of those factors that come out of those principles. I saw at the theatre national strategic level little scope or point in getting into the ethics or the morality of the war. Once the decision is made, it's more about the ethical or moral behaviour of your troops and your decision-making in the conduct of the operation, because that you can influence. However, in contradiction, there's still a need to present a positive rationale to your community and the troops who are going into harm's way. So there is a contradiction at times. You're not going to send troops into harm's way and say, well, it's really good for a party political domestic platform, or it plays well with our allies. You've got to give the troops a little more than that. So for me, the practicalities are in how you then carry out the operation and the role of ethical behaviour. The second part of a just war is where reality and ethics tend to intersect, and that I found useful. So ethics in the conduct of the operation. And I suppose the 3 principles there that I found useful were discrimination, proportionality and necessity. These 3 points all mattered to me, and to me for the ethics of war, because I found them directly relevant for my decision making. But other essential factors beyond ethics are in play, and they will impact decision making, and they will impact ethics, your interpretation of them, and the decisions you make and compromises that you make or do not. So what are some of these elements? I'll touch on a few. I'd argue ethics don't exist in a vacuum. They're not all absolute. And in operations there will, of necessity, be compromises, in part because you don't always have all the information. There are a number of elements that impact decisions in ethics. The influence of each can vary at any point in time, so they're not presented here in any specific order or priority. But it is here that ethics may confront reality. The safety of your troops, politics, culture, media, ambitions, institutional agendas, and the vagaries of community expectations. But perhaps first politics, because we usually go to war or conduct military operations for political reasons, and those reasons will influence the ethical boundaries of the operation, from the forces and firepower deployed, and if they're going to be adequate to do the job, through to the rules of engagement and political intervention during the operation. Politics at the theatre, strategic, national level is pervasive, and only the most naive would expect it to be otherwise. Politics can be national and international practices. It's alliances and relationships. It can be about seeking advantage, not directly related to the specific conflict. Then there are the institutional politics, rivalries between the services, both in Australia and amongst our allies. Different branches will compete to influence force structure, command, and their role. One, because that's what everyone's trained for and no one wants to miss out, but some with a mind on future budgets and careers. There will be bureaucratic politics between different departments, personalities in departments, people seeking control, influence, rivalries that play out, and ambitions, which I'll come back to. Politics or personalities can lead to command elements being bypassed, and in a significant way, here and overseas, and I've seen both occur on a grand scale. There is also, though, a necessary political element of a sales pitch to the community. It may be correct, it may skirt around the truth, or it might only be partially correct. It may introduce elements that are unrealistic into the mission that a commander and troops may then need to work around. There is the politics of our elected officials with perhaps different collective and individual motivations, both government and opposition. And as I said, there's the politics of different departments. Defence and DFAT sometimes have healthy rivalries, sometimes we cooperate. With allies, this might manifest itself into splits that lead to quite different reporting coming into the Australian government. And there can be issues of personal power between senior bureaucrats and, on occasion, their personal political views. I've been put in the position where I was sending one set of reports in the lead up to an operation which was diametrically opposed to the report coming through the diplomatic chain. And it was an interesting exercise to try and explain how our allies were operating on a different structure and two different stories, and one didn't know what was actually happening. How do you play the ethics of that out in terms of as a commander? The danger is that this can flow down to the troops, and it also shapes the circumstances where the rules of engagement are applied, resourcing, the support to you as a commander to get the job done, and the troops on the ground, or limitations placed on the commander and troops. And it led, certainly in most of the operations I've seen, to very arbitrary decisions, but not necessarily helpful for being successful in the operation. Legal issues are key. You need to ensure your intended action is legal, but if it's legal, does it make it ethical? Something might fit within the rules of engagement, but is it necessary? And often you can put an argument either way if you're clever enough to say something is necessary or not. And then you kind of start to come down to the ethical question of whether you need to do something. There can also be a degree of subjectivity in terms of proportionality and necessity, perhaps also in discrimination. I was fortunate at a practical level that I had excellent legal advisors in a series of appointments. There were people who give you a pretty clear answer, not the on one hand this, on the other hand this, not a third hand something else. And we used them along with the commanders in terms of the rules of engagement. In Iraq, we spent a lot of time with the pilots and the SAS, briefings from me, component commanders, unit commanders and lawyers to set the scene, to talk about what was legal, talk about ethics, talk about culture. And we're fortunate we had some time to do it. A key thing, for instance, was that it actually was all right to bring back ordnance. If the pilot for a reason felt, no, I'm not going to drop or the circumstances have changed, then they had that decision. But not only do you have to allow them that latitude to make that call, You've got to do it in a culture where they don't feel ostracised for doing the right thing. And I think building that was very important. We did the same sort of detailed preparation with the SAS. So what of culture? It's pervasive and it'll vary incredibly. Ethics do not always translate between individuals, religions, organisations or countries. You should not assume that you're always dealing with ethical people on your side or the same ethics. You need to understand the ethics or lack thereof in the opposition. Will they use human shields, locate in hospitals, schools, or murder prisoners? How will your force deal with that? And how does that bring up the balance of probabilities when you may, for instance, as you alluded to, put civilians in danger? What's the greater good of the decision? Sometimes there isn't a good decision. There's a bad one and a really, really bad one. And that's where your ethics become quite challenging. A small example, just of how people look at things differently, a matter that we might consider unacceptable, that's quite acceptable to others. The multinational headquarters in Kabul. My people there at one stage were working 24/7. They were on the dry. For non-Australians, it's no alcohol. But they slept or they worked or exercised. They were making decisions that could mean life or death for someone. But this wasn't the same for some of our other Western allies. Significant alcohol consumption and access to pornography, particularly using the IT system while on duty, was considered a right. And it created a major issue when we stepped in to stop it. We might consider it both an ethical and a practical operational issue and wrong. Others do not. And we've seen far worse behaviour in other operations we've been involved on where we've had, say, UN contingents from countries with very different perspectives to ours. And your question then becomes, what's your mandate to do anything about it? You may not. In fact, you may have no legal or other authority to do anything about it. And that becomes an interesting ethical challenge for you and also particularly for the troops on the ground. I certainly found that as a junior officer in Lebanon, and I know it's been very challenging for some of our troops on the ground in some of the countries we've worked in recent decades. For our troops on the ground, it might be some pretty confronting social practices that are abhorrent to us but accepted in the culture of the country and outside our mandate. You also need to consider if the culture can be influenced by your role and responsibilities and casualties. Will your own organisational culture change? And I think it can. Now, not for a moment playing down the impact of every Australian casualty we've had in recent years. It's the US that's had the lead role in significant casualties. And the same could be said comparatively to some of our other allies. Australia hasn't had the primary responsibility for prosecuting the wars in the Middle East or even managing a province. We shied away from it for a variety of reasons. And we've been able to be relatively selective in where we deployed and what we did. Makes it much easier to make ethical decisions at times in that case. In Iraq, our forces did very useful tasks and that was valued by the US. But success and failure was really down to the US. The major part of the ground forces at risk were American soldiers. And when you're the one taking the risk, it can influence culture, risk, aggressiveness, and the interplay of various elements with ethics and perceptions of ethics. In Timor, we did lead and did it well. It was difficult and challenging and involved varying cultures in the coalition. But it was not war on the scale of the Middle East with its ethical challenges. Even our culture of advising on the decision to go to war in Iraq contrasts quite interestingly with the very formal process of the US, where I was fortunate to sit in on the final stage where the President and the Cabinet briefed Commanders CENTCOM and the senior commanders. For me, the Australian process and culture was far more informal, but then you could argue we didn't have quite as much skin in the game. The media, with modern communications, with the internet, mobile phones, and even helmet cams on troops, you can't avoid it. Although if helmet cams are for the troops to protect themselves after operations, it's an interesting comment on our ethics and trust. The media, you need to consider whether they are ethical. Are they simply a business? Do you need to treat them ethically? Is there an obligation to provide information to the public? How much do you tell the media and the public? Do you present the party line? What do you do if you know something's untrue? Is it important enough to do something about, or is it something that can go through to the keeper? Is lying to the media unethical or simply dangerous? Is omission of information okay, or the selective provision of information? On my part, I treated the media as a significant line of operations. We did an intelligence analysis of them as I would on any opponent. In truth, like any profession, there are many very professional, committed and ethical people in the media, but there are a few that are not. So you need to go into it with your eyes wide open. You also need to understand the difference between the different groups in the media and engage them. Media may also hold an ethical mirror up to you in your operations and decisions, and it may not always be fun. And they may ask difficult questions. But remember, at the end of the day, certainly in Australia, they'll influence your community, politicians and the people you deal with in Canberra. They are a critical element in your consideration of culture, ethics and community expectations. So they play on ethical decisions in some ways as well. So community expectations, they're linked to the media and politics. My view in Iraq, going back to the first 6 principles of the just war, is that the decision to commit forces is political. And my line was, if people object, there's a political process. I certainly was very keen to avoid the circumstance that some people faced during Vietnam, where their families were targeted for a government decision. And I think in that we were pretty successful. I only had one instance, one bad instance where my family was targeted. But your subsequent actions on operations may be judged by the community, also your ethics and culture, often in slow time well after the event. So for me with the community, I suppose the shorthand in my decision making at any level was, will my decision or actions pass the front page of the Australian test or the pub test? It may be legal, but would it be ethical and meet community expectations of our military and the image or standards that we publicly promote of our military? Ambitions and personalities. I won't spend too long on that because I suspect most of you have been exposed to it at one stage or another. But ambitions, yours, subordinates, senior officers, public servants, politicians, institutions, as I mentioned, cause, services, impact ethics and cultures. People will come with different motivations. Some will be looking for personal gain out of an operation, and it can shape their decisions, their level of risk and what they're prepared to do or not do. And people are flawed. Some need to be liked, some don't want to be seen as soft, some don't want to be seen as too tough. You'll deal with people outside the military who have no concept of operations or the application of violence. I do worry about people using movies as a point of reference. When I have senior people who influence decisions using something out of a movie as a reference point, it does worry me at times. We face a similar problem to the one you raised at the end, I think. But all of that, whether all those things that influence people, whether it's just power promotion or something else, impacts ethics, culture and the decisions, both good and bad. So working with these elements, what are a couple of ethical issues and where do you compromise? I come back to discrimination, proportionality and necessity. And I will refer here to a couple of air operations because they were some of the ones that were challenging. And I suppose I should say at the beginning that they were only a very small number of the operations. I didn't find too many of them became an ethical issue. But there were a couple that were particularly so. So discrimination. I also say, again, we Australia had at times, the luxury of seeking agreed targets. We didn't always have to take what came up. We got the target lists early for Iraq and we worked out which ones we didn't want to do. We took out the ones that were risky. And that makes it a bit easier for your force. If you can carefully select for minimal risk of danger to civilians or your aircraft being shot down, you avoid some ethical issues at times. But you do need to consider even then things like smart bombs, assuming no pilot error. Can you assume sound intelligence? Can you assume there'll be no fault in the weapon? An interesting percentage of these smart weapons actually have technical failures, and even if everything else is lined up, you can still hit the wrong thing. So do you take a risk? If you say, okay, the larger circuit of this, or diameter of the target area, if it goes wrong, means we might have a mosque, school or hospital potentially in it. Do you just not hit the target? Can you avoid it? Is that going to provide the support that the ground forces need? So you start getting into some interesting questions in terms of discrimination and civilians. We had an issue once where we tracked a guy, a known IED organiser and organiser of attacks on coalition forces, very successful. He killed quite a number of the coalition troops. And we identified him clearly, and we had a drone in place, he and about 30 of his closest friends, but they parked themselves next to a compound. Do you take the shot? You know from intelligence he's planning another spectacular against your forces. Well, we didn't, and we were told we couldn't, in fact. And this guy was a very hard guy to pick up, and we'd actually picked him up. We tracked him again, second day, same thing, parked himself next to the next compound with young men and women, and young women and children. And again, there's only about 15, 16 of his closest friends with him at this stage. Do we hold off and he disappears? And what? We lose a bunch of people and then we try again. So you come back to this argue of discrimination. My preference was to take the shot. Again, we were told we could not do it. Fortunately, he stayed with us, and the next time he didn't park himself as closely to some civilians, so the problem went away. But what if we'd not taken the shot the second time, he'd disappeared off our radar, and then we lost 20 people in the next spectacular? What's the ethical decision? Those are the ones I found as a commander where you got that reach down in terms of what you can do for political and other reasons. And I found those challenging. When do you destroy infrastructure? Do you blow bridges? What happens to hospitals if you hit the electricity infrastructure? Proportionality. Do you actually hit? Do you always need to use targets? Do you hit targets? Do you go without weapons? On one occasion, which it's been in the public arena, I played the red card in Iraq over proportionality. I considered unsuitable some of the air weapons being planned for our break-in entry to Baghdad. My question led to, in the command theatre, some, it was quite spectacular with the big VTCs, public yelling, personal abuse and some pretty unpleasant behaviour by a senior officer. Now, in fairness, there was the temerity of an Army officer questioning a US Air Force officer on air-delivered ordnance. And there was also the statement that if this costs the life of one American soldier holding back on these weapons, you'll be personally responsible. It was ethically interesting in terms of both discrimination and proportionality. What would the consequences been if Ken Gillespie, Peter Cosgrove and ultimately Howard had not backed my decision? What if they're Australian battalions going into Baghdad facing possible urban warfare and heavy casualties? Would the decision have been different? Personally, I've no doubt the Air Force officer was wrong. It turned out he hadn't read the detail of his own operational order, which said in their own order several of the weapons were unsuitable for urban areas, and the answer was very different weapon systems, some ground-based. But after a very frosty, at times deeply unpleasant and lonely 24 hours, the US commander, having checked the facts, said the assessment was correct. None of us wanted a trip to The Hague. So proportionality, an element of judgment comes into play. But was I being overcautious? Was there could you damage relationships? What's the line between overwhelming firepower and the safety of your forces? Necessity, on another occasion, and again, as I said, these are only a very small number in the many, so tens of thousands. There was a plan put forward to drop the mother of all bombs, the MOAD, another ordnance on a regular Iraqi division that we judged was no longer a direct threat. Fortunately, the US 3rd Army, Marines and 7th Fleet also stepped in and backed us on the question of why strike the target. The response is, well, the Air Force might as well pack up and go home. to which I responded, that was actually probably fairly good if it meant we'd won. But I must admit I'm not on the Christmas card list of that particular officer. So where does it leave you ethically? Ethics are personal, situational, and practice can be about compromise and the best of several bad options. Different wars are fought for different purposes and call for different military plans to carry out their purposes. But they're all about killing the enemy ultimately, and that's unlikely to change. But the way in which an army goes about doing it will change due to politics, ethics, new technology, legal issues, community expectations, and the like. And I'm very cautious of those who try and package up neat answers, lists, or adopt a position of very righteousness about ethics. It's never that clean, it's usually grey. Personal values and experience impact. And as I said, there's not always a clean answer ethically to the question of right and wrong. I'll jump forward to just two final points. One I'll call a distortion effect, and I think it's already been referred to in some ways. My experience in Lebanon was where the abnormal becomes normal, people can break from ethical behaviour. If there's little basic decency, social structure, ethos, ethics, the psychopaths and the sociopaths operate without constraint. And certainly outside the military context there, amongst the militias and others, I saw that. As a later speakers might address, how do we avoid getting drawn into this descent into barbarism? But where do we also balance it with it being inside or outside our mandate and legal authority when you're there? You see bad things, but do you actually have the authority to do anything about it? I also worry that if you spend too long in a relatively unfettered environment, you can lose perspective. In the Middle East, where we had a very large machine, complex scale, cultural ambiguity, a lot of aggression, speed, a difficult enemy, a range of difficult enemies, the rules can appear fluid. Serious damage and casualties can occur, and you can be drawn into the culture and circumstance, and you can cross the line in terms of ethics. I think your perspective can get distorted if you're not careful, and that's perhaps where ethics comes back in. And I think weaponry developments too will challenge this. The ethics of drone warfare. Does it become too easy and removed watching on a screen, or watching a special forces raid on the screen? Is it easy to have your values change or become distorted? And I think that's where training, discipline and ethics are important. Lastly, this might be a little bit something to think about and maybe a little controversial, but it's probably not politically correct to question our commitment to ethics, but I've occasionally wondered how much that commitment has been tested. Will your ethics change if you're really seriously hurt, if there's been enough damage done? And I go back to a comment made to me some years ago, and I'll paraphrase very loosely. Most hold Abraham Lincoln as a great statesman, a wartime leader, a politician, but arguably a man of strong moral and ethical views. In very simple terms, in 1861, you might characterise the strategy of both sides as send two armies, they're going to meet, there'll be a battle, and the issue might be resolved. However, if right at the outset you said to Lincoln, no, that's not a strategy. What you need is mass mobilisation of manpower into the military, harness the complete industrial might of the North for war in the South, suspend habeas corpus, set up nasty prisoner of war camps, blockade the South, and then shred the economic, political, social and civilian structure of the South, and maybe suspend the rights of other citizens. They would have thought you're not only unethical, but probably mad. But a few years later, perhaps that's where they were moving. Again, it's not to make light of any significant costs paid by individual soldiers and their family, and ethically the support we should be providing them. But you could argue that Australia and the ADF has not faced serious threat to our national security or serious casualties on the scale of some of our allies for several generations. We've been able to be selective in our commitments. And I just wonder what the ethical and cultural impact would be if we suffered significant national damage and ongoing heavy casualties. I'm not sure we do know how we'd react until it happens. The positive thing is currently I think we get it right most of the time. We do care about ethics and we have some very experienced people, and it's a good baseline. In conclusion, if you're lucky, your legal position on the decision may be clear and even ethical, but ethics will be personal and situational. I was fortunate to have great mentors and examples in that. I also saw some other less ethical behaviours during my career, which adds to your perspective. I was particularly fortunate to have two very good experienced commanders in King Gillespie and Peter Cosgrove at critical times in critical appointments, and a very grounded Chief of Staff in Iraq, Ross Boyd, who's a great sounding board, and would tell me if he thought I was being an idiot. I am perhaps a touch cynical, but I do continue to have considerable confidence in the decision-making of our current commanders in the field, which I outlined in an interview to The Australian last year, and my views on that haven't changed. But there is a personal impact on both those making the decisions and those executing the decisions. And the best I can offer is that you ensure, first, it's legal, and second, you can live with your decision or action, maybe even apply the pub test, because you do have to live with your decisions and actions at the end of the day. Thanks for your time. Happy to take any questions if there's time left.
We've got time for a shortish question if you'd like to ask. Thank you. Just sit.
G'day, so Group Captain Matt Haggerty from Air Force Headquarters. I want to ask you to go back to something that you touched on, and it's something that probably many of us occasionally get uncomfortable with, and that's this concept that Australia has for some time now participated in wars of choice and then chosen, perhaps wisely, very carefully about how it will participate in those wars. I'm wondering if there's also a conflicting ethical issue when we choose to avoid accountabilities because we make decisions about avoiding the more difficult areas. Is there an ethics issue there for us, or an honour issue there for us, if we say to the US, we're in, but by the way, we're not going to do the difficult stuff, we'll leave you to deal with that and we'll stay on the edge. Now, that's an oversimplification, and I do not need to...
No, I think it's quite clear. No, I think there is. You can say, and I think politically and for a number of those considerations, you could argue that we've been very clever in getting maximum outcome, often in unrelated areas, for a minimal risk. I mean, it was pretty clear to me if I lost one F-18, I might survive, or lost two, well, I should be looking for a new job. But I think we have, and I think that is part of the dilemma. And it doesn't matter whether it's where we have, you can't do it always, but a lot of the time we've been selective in our commitment, selective in our targeting. We went to extraordinary lengths to technically not take prisoners in Iraq. Where you try explaining that to the people you're working with at sort of theatre or national level from other countries. Uruzgan, you can say for a number of different reasons we chose not to run the place. You went to Kabul, there was no Australian flag on any of the maps. It was Dutch and then American. And at a time when we had a 2-star, one or two 1-stars, and several full colonels, we had an American colonel coming in to run Uruzgan province after the Dutch, because that way we could have this veneer of protection in terms of responsibility. Now, I'm probably being a little overcritical because there are other tough things that have been done and things we have taken accountability for, and there's a number that, for reasons, because I've had privileged access or involvement, I didn't go into today. So we have taken some tough things, but at a strategic and theatre national political level, I think there is an ethical issue. But you also then need to have the discussion of, do we really want to be there at all, or why are we there? And we don't tend to have that discussion in Australia. And it also tends to be above yours and my pay grade. I know we should be going to war on moral grounds, but actually it's decided by the Parliament.
We'll need to break there. If it is the case that wisdom is measured by the ability to find and to ask the right question, then we've had a very wise presentation this morning. Would you please join with me in thanking General McNarn?